I tried silencing the inner critic for 3 days. Now, I cannot say that I fully succeeded, but what I found out is truly disturbing, and it can actually save you from the unconscious trap that perpetuates you into self-criticism, self-condemnation, and keeps the inner critic alive. So if you want to get rid of it, or at least get one step closer to that process, then stay with me until the end, and I'll share with you what I found out, what you can do about the inner critic, and how this unconscious trap really works so that you can understand it and observe it for yourself. Hey there, I am Daniel, and I'm here to trick you into life of higher consciousness. Now, with this experiment that I've tried upon myself, I actually just tried it for only 3 days, so it doesn't take a lot to understand how this mechanism works. Let me guide you through this journey, okay? Shall we start? The first day, what I've noticed by just observing, being aware of this part of me that is critical of myself and of others, what I found out to be the biggest theme of the first day is that my inner critic, by observing it, by being aware of it, by expanding that awareness of this inner voice within that is destructive, the main theme of the first day was that I needed to take inventory for my past unconscious rejection, self-condemnation, and ridicule that I've experienced in my life, which is something that I believe happened to everybody, haven't it? Because think about it for a moment. Why does the self-critic, the inner self-critic, torture you? Where does it come from, really? If we take a moment to investigate, to inquire in that, what we might find out and what is the conclusion that we might reach is that the self-critic, it is just a reflection of the attitudes that others had towards us through our childhood upbringing. And I remembered, I looked at the feelings that it triggered within me, and I was able to remember, to recall all these memories of when I was ridiculed while growing up at school. Then I remembered how I tried to protect myself from that and tried to have vengeance of the destructive behavior others had toward me by becoming critical of myself and then critical of others. So this is what I discovered in the first day of that experiment of trying to silence that inner critic. And it's not really possible to silence it unless we observe it first. So this is something else that I found out. We cannot really fight something that we don't understand. You cannot change that part of you, the inner critic that tortures you sometimes, if you don't understand it first. So that's why it's really important to maybe ask ourselves, where does it come from? And see what comes up if you take the time to ask that question for yourself. Where does the inner critic come from? What is its purpose? What is it trying to protect you from? Or what does it give you? Because it's not random. And I genuinely believe that everything that's happening in our life is in our highest benefit. Even the negative parts of life, right? The negative circumstances or the negative mind traps that we find ourselves in. So if we are able to uncover the hidden payoff that the inner critic really gives us, then we are able to understand it, and then little by little can we take the steps to let it go. So this was the theme of the first day, and I'll get into the unconscious trap, the mechanism, how that all works in a moment. But this was what I uncovered in the first day. Now, what happened going forward in the second day, I was able to find out by observing the inner critic, and I needed to be really patient and observe that inner dialogue and the suppressed reactions that were coming from the inside as emotional reactions to what I was being impatient of on the outside. And there was actually this little experience that happened. I was just being at home. There was this old lady that knocked on my door and she needed support, help with something on her phone. She was impaired, visually impaired, and she needed help to unlock her phone and call her relative so that she can have contact with her. And generally, I find myself being really impatient with people like that. But being on that experiment, silencing the inner critic, I decided to not react, to just observe my reactions. And then I decided to support her, even though it took like 30 minutes or 20 minutes or something like that. It wasn't the most interesting experience, but even though that was the case, even though it was a little boring, I decided to just observe it. And I found out that this inner dialogue within me, that the inner critic in a way perpetuates, is always being impatient, is always being judgmental and critical of others. And I was able to clearly see that the attitude I have to others is the same attitude I have towards my own self-image. In my process of self-growth, pursuing my dreams, so on and so forth, if I'm being judgmental of others, then I'm inevitably, unconsciously being judgmental of myself. And by observing that, I understood that if I take the time to be patient enough and acknowledge the inner critic, how it's judging others, and just observe that, don't take part in that play, just observe it, be detached from it. If that's the case, then I can catch myself when the inner critic is criticizing my best efforts in pursuing my dreams and fulfilling my potential. So this is of high importance, because if we can see how we are unconsciously judging others and take accountability of that, take responsibility of that, then we can catch ourselves when the inner critic is judging us. Doesn't that sound useful? Now, let me know. So this is what I found out in the second day. On the third day, it was the moment when it intensified the most. What I was able to find on the third day is that I catched myself projecting and criticizing other people who are in my field. Now, just a little bit of context, what I mean by that. I was on this event, which was with two spiritual teachers, and I went there with friends. And I was just listening to their talks, to their lectures, right? And one of them was really boring. I myself am in that field for the last 3 years or something, having made courses, workshops, delivered lectures and things like that. And I am on that journey. I'm being a little bit critical of how good of a job I'm doing. And I noticed that I had the same critical and projecting attitude of those people that I was listening to on that event where I went with my friends on that third day. But I was really, I wasn't able, that's why I said I tried to silence the inner critic. I wasn't able to silence it because it was really strong. And even though I did my best, I found that these reactions were coming up and I was being a little impatient, a little frustrated. I was condemnating one of the spiritual teachers there, the other one I really related with. And I was having the same attitude that I had towards them, towards me, but this was unconscious. It became evident, it became obvious. And this is again what happens all the time. If we look at the inner critic for a moment, really look at it. The inner critic, it exists because we are critical on the outside. Now, we might think of ourselves that we are really positive and really good people and suppress those critical judgments of others. But if you find yourself being critical of yourself, then I know for sure, and I challenge you to find that out for yourself that you are inevitably judgmental and critical of others. If you're critical of yourself, 100% that criticality, that judgmentalism is expressed, is projected to others. This is where part of the fuel, what fuels the inner critic, the fuel that it needs to torture your mind, this is where it comes from. That unconscious critical attitude of others. And if you're able to catch yourself doing that and let it go, which is the hardest part, the most challenging part, but if that's the case, then obviously, inevitably, that would have an effect on your own inner critic attitude towards your own self-image. Does this make sense? Do you follow me so far? So this is what I've discovered in those 3 days. And then I decided to structure that, put it in this explanation that's easy to understand. Because if we see that mechanism of what's happening, how the inner critic operates, then we are able to be more acknowledging of it, more observing, more aware of it, and let it go more and more through our everyday lives. So let me show you what I've discovered. The inner critic, it always stems from low self-worth. This is where it's coming from. If your image of yourself is not worthy enough in the way you describe yourself, in the way you view yourself, in the way you picture yourself, if you don't see yourself as worthy enough just because of how you view yourself, then what happens is that the inner critic will hide from you, it will hide from your consciousness, from your awareness through projection. So this is what happens, right? This is what I was just explaining. The inner critic, since it doesn't want to accept that low self-worth that it believes about you, it will project it onto others. So it will be critical, judgmental, and it will be projecting that your faults that you don't want to accept of yourself and work through, it will project them onto others. So the inner critic is actually an outer critic in disguise, if that makes sense. And it hides from you through projection. Now you can catch yourself doing that on a daily basis if you want to observe the inner critic. What happens next is that through that criticism and projection of others, it inflates its own self-worth, low self-worth through comparison. So again, if we want to understand what is the purpose of the inner critic, how does it really benefit us? If it benefits us in some way, what would you think is the answer? Since it has low self-worth, it's a mental projection, it's not really real. The inner critic is not who you are at the core of who you are. The inner critic is just an image you have of yourself, okay? And so since it has low self-worth, it tries to inflate its worth, self-worth, through comparison to others. And that's why it has that need to judge and criticize others. Because if it can do that, then it's almost like I can find the faults in others to take a loan from their self-confidence and give it to myself without the intention of giving it back. Does this make sense? So it's like the inner critic is a substitute for true self-confidence coming from within, that is self-sufficient by itself, because it's coming from your inner dialogue you have towards your own self. But since that's not the case, since the inner critic has low self-worth, it has the need to compare itself to others, find the faults in others that it's not willing to admit it has within, and then it's being critical and judgmental. So as a rule of thumb, what we can take from that, anything that you judge, condemn, and reject in others, you judge, condemn, and reject in yourself. But you're not willing to look at and say, yes, that's the case. Yes, that's true. And yes, even though I don't like that, I'm willing to forgive myself about it. So as a rule of thumb, this is what we can take. Now, there is a way we can flip that. So depending on whether the inner critic is repressed or expressed, this can look like in a different way. Instead of finding the faults in others, it's like taking a loan from their self-confidence to give it to yourself without the intention to give it back. That's the expressed nature. The repressed nature, though, it looks in a little bit different way. You put others on a pedestal, you see them as more than they are, then you see yourself as less than them, and then you need to substitute, you need to cope, you need to, in a way, fill that gap through self-criticism, through, criticizing yourself, because you're seeing others as more than they are. You're not looking at others on the same level as you are. You see them as more than they are, and that gap needs to be filled through that self-criticism. On the other hand, if you see others as lower than you are, then you need to express that criticism. That's the expressed nature. So that's the only difference. The repressed or the expressed nature, the only difference between the two is that the repressed nature doesn't necessarily need to express its criticism of others. And that's why it needs to cope with that. It needs to take that energy and direct it within as intense self-criticism, while the expressed nature, it expresses some of that critical energy to others, and then it inflates its own self-worth, which is what I try to explain here. So this is the unconscious trap of how the inner critic works. Does this make sense? Do you follow me so far? Do you see yourself in some of the things that I'm sharing? Because if you if you see yourself in some of the things that I'm sharing, then most likely you're asking the question, okay, Danny, that sounds beautiful and a little bit terrifying, but what can I do about it? Now, obviously, I haven't really mastered that inner self-criticism, but what I found out through these 72 hours of experimentation is that simply recognizing and acknowledging the inner critic is an act of self-love. Now, think about it for a moment. You notice that you're being critical of yourself, or you notice that you're being critical of others. Instead of trying to change that, trying to force yourself out of that attitude of criticism, trying to frame it as being something bad and you need to be better, instead of doing that, which is what the ego wants to do, right? Instead of doing that, you just acknowledge. And I just acknowledge that there is an inner critic. That act of acknowledgement, of recognition, is healing by itself. It's an act of self-love. Because we can then ask ourselves the question, who is the one recognizing? Who is the one acknowledging? And this is where your power lies. Your awareness of being, the awareness of the inner critic, is giving it power. So if you just observe and acknowledge and recognize, and that's it, you don't want to change. All these feelings, all these repressed emotions, feelings, the impatience, the frustration, the condemnation, the anger, the guilt, the shame, all these feelings inevitably come up for you to recognize them again, and through that act of recognition, release them and let them go. And now, if you want to go really deep in the letting go practice, I'll put a video in the description below, which is the 4-step process for letting go, which is, I think it's an amazing video. You can check it out. You might find it really useful and beneficial. But this is what the inner critic is all about. And my friend, the only way I believe you can silence it is through recognition and acknowledgement. The inner critic is not wrong. It's not bad. It just is a substitute for low self-worth. It wants to increase your worth through criticizing you or criticizing others so that it can prove to itself that it's worthy. But instead, if you just acknowledge and recognize it, see it for what it is, then your self-worth becomes self-evident. You're able to see yourself as being whole and complete. And I genuinely believe this is who each of us are, whole and complete. So this was my message for the day, my friend. If you liked this video, if you found it insightful or thought-provoking, please like it because it can reach more people. Subscribe to the channel, and I will see you around in the higher consciousness with Danny, where I will trick you into living life of higher consciousness design. Thank you so much for watching. See you around, my friend.